to this DIME Journal Club, and our topic that we'll be discussing this morning is a really interesting new article that our colleagues from Pfizer has just published, called Considerations for Conducting Bring Your Own Device BYOD clinical studies. And the team will talk us through the study and their methods, as well as some of their key takeaways. But this is really all about the informal opportunity for you all to ask questions of our authors here. And so I'll be here moderating the discussion, as in calling on people who are either posting questions in the chat, or as you know, with all of DIME sessions, we encourage you to, if you're in a place where you can, to raise your hand and we will unmute you and you can ask your question live, so we can really make this a discussion. So with that, and I'm going to ask my colleague Katie to remind me if I'm missing any housekeeping items here. I believe that, there we go, housekeeping. All right, so we are recording this session. So any of your colleagues who may have missed it, you can direct them to the recording that'll be up on our website. And again, as I said, please, let's make this really interactive. So go ahead and pose questions in the chat, or if you wish, raise your hand and Katie or I will unmute you and let you ask live. So with that, I am going to pass it over to our colleagues, Charmaine and Pirinka. Would you please first introduce yourselves and then dive right into your presentation?
So thank you so much, Lynette, for this opportunity and for the great introduction. So I'm Charmaine Demanuele. I am an executive director at Pfizer, and I lead quantitative sciences for digital sciences and translational imaging. So my group is focused on the development of new digital endpoints using statistics and data science. Pirinka, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Charmaine. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here presenting at the DIME Journal Club. My name is Pirinka Georgiev. I'm an associate director and clinician within the Digital Sciences and Translational Imaging Group in early clinical development at Pfizer.
Great. So let's start discussing our paper. And I want to say that this paper originated as part of the DIME Research Committee. It's one of the working groups from the DIME Research Committee. And we brought together basically people from academia, from industry, from patient advocacy groups to basically think about the concept of conducting bring your own device clinical studies and setting up a framework to help really a broad range of stakeholders in deploying these kind of models in clinical studies. So I don't need to tell you that digital health technologies are attracting a lot of attention as novel tools for collecting data in clinical trials and clinical research. And there are a lot of advantages to bring your own device models in clinical research. It has the potential to be more user-friendly because it allows participants to use devices and technologies that they are familiar with. And so it reduces, for example, the Hawthorne effect because they're used to using these devices in their daily lives. It can ensure better participant compliance and also reduces bias when it comes to introducing new technologies. So basically, I want to first talk about a little bit the D in the BYOD. So when we discussed what is D, what is the device we have in mind? So traditionally, BYOD, we used to refer more to having a phone with ePros on it. In this case, with device, we really mean a digital health technologies. And that could be a smartphone, which has an app from the study that's basically either collecting data passively or asking for participants to perform some performance outcome assessment, etc. So basically the phone is serving as the hub for us to get the data. It could also be a situation where you have the phone connected with some wearable technology or other DHT, and basically via the study app, the phone is getting the data to the study hub. Or it could be that it's a wearable device by itself that's basically transmitting data via Bluetooth or Wi-Fi connection to the study hub. So really by device, we really mean a digital health technology, which can be a combination of phones as well as wearable and other type of technologies. And what we'd like to do is really provide some insights into the study design and operational requirements to ensure that when we do BYOD in clinical studies, we really have successful implementation of this model. So next slide, please. Great. So we asked ourselves, is it really the right time for bring your own device? And we feel the answer is yes. The building blocks are lining up to really start leveraging BYOD models in clinical trials. One, there is an increase in drastic growth in the smartphone ownership, both in the US and also across the world. There's also a growth of ownership in wearable technology and digital devices by individuals that use them to monitor their own health in their daily lives every day. There also is an increased sophistication among the general population in the use of the health apps available, and many health apps are available now and being used by the general audience. And then there has been, especially during the COVID times, in the early phase of the pandemic, there has been publications of very large surveillance studies where a BYOD approach was adopted to collect thousands of data points from flu and COVID and also other respiratory diseases studies. So those have been like large-scale surveillance study, observational studies, which looked at activity and heart rate and voice, etc. There's also an increased interest by pharma in the BYOD approach because of the push towards decentralized clinical trials. And so BYOD can be one of the components of the DCT approach. Next slide, please. But is it feasible, especially to deploy in drug development, right? When we have interventional trials, can we run a drug development clinical trial and generate robust data that enables the recruitment of a diverse population as defined in the study protocol, and have a protocol approved by the ethics board, so takes into consideration all aspects of the study design and acceptable by regulatory authorities? So what we try to do here is really use the Agency for Health Research and Quality Guidelines, the AHRQ guidelines, which you might be familiar with because they are used for real-world evidence study design, and basically use this to develop a framework for deploying a BYOD model. And really what we had in mind when creating this framework is having really a broad audience to provide considerations for anyone in academic research, in drug development, also patient advocacy organizations when conducting or assessing BYOD models. And what Pirinka will do in the next phase of the presentation is go through these 5 pillars of the framework in quite some detail. And we hope then to have a discussion about these different aspects. So Pirinka, I pass it on to you.
Thanks, Charmaine. So our first part in the framework is really identifying and engaging with both your internal and external stakeholders. Once you're able to understand the needs, concerns, and the impact that your BYOD study is going to have on these groups, then you'll be able to really improve the quality and efficiency of your study. So we propose doing this in 3 different steps, starting with stakeholder mapping, really identifying who is involved both from an internal perspective within your organization, and then also externally, such as the study participant, their caregivers, their HCPs. And you can kind of see some examples on the slides here who might those internal and external stakeholders be. And then the second step is stakeholder engagement, ensuring that there's really a bi-directional interaction and ways to communicate in order to gain understanding both from those who are conducting the study and then everyone else who is involved or has a stake in the process. And then the third step, of course, being stakeholder management, facilitating that smooth operationalization of the BYOD study once you are managing your stakeholders from, startup through conduct, execution, and closeout, you'll have a much more successful study. Next slide, please. So diving into how do we do this from a study design perspective. Starting to think about your study objectives is always critically important in any study, but when it comes to a BYOD study design, we always want to ensure that this design is at least minimally equivalent and providing equivalent data to that of a traditional study, and ideally it's also adding value and providing additional insights that a standard approach might not be able to provide to us. So when you're thinking about the specifications of your BYOD device and the data, really consider the data context. A BYOD study can be a lot different than one with provision devices. And it may be important to capture information and metadata on the data source, such as the device model or the version that someone may be using, as it could vary across your study population. And along with that, it's important to define a minimum set of technical requirements that you need to generate those study endpoints, which again might be having a certain model or version, perhaps an operating system, in order to be able to capture the data and also transmit it properly. Also, while you're designing your study, it's really important to develop an eligibility criteria that is inclusive and includes all of those of interest within your population. A lot of the times, devices and owning devices can be associated with someone and people of higher socioeconomic class. So considering what you're selecting should be something that is feasible for many different kinds of people to obtain in order to be able to participate. Or perhaps you might need to consider provisioning devices or offering perks like internet connection and internet access to be paid for. And going into that is also recruitment. When you are recruiting this population, think about using a variety of recruitment tactics to recruit them. So that could be social media, print ads, broadcast radio ads, things like that. If you limit to only one tactic, like social media, again, you might be targeting a certain population and might not get perhaps those that are in an area that doesn't have as good internet connection and they're not as in the loop on social media. And when you're building your informed consent and ethics, you really want to make sure that that is tailored to the population of interest in a manner that they can understand, and any type of interaction that they have with the device needs to be simple enough and responsive and intuitive. And there also needs to be an easy process for the participants to be able to either disengage from the technology in the study or withdraw consent if they choose to no longer participate. Next slide, please. And the third item in our framework is really thinking about the outcomes that you're selecting when you're selecting your BYOD device. The outcomes should be clinically meaningful to the patient population. Regulators have even come out and said that sometimes that can be even more important than aligning to an already validated clinical metric. Your endpoints should of course be reliable and accurate, measure against the treatment effects, and then be validated against an appropriate reference standard. And we reference a lot of this in with the V3 framework and the evidence checklist when selecting your digital endpoints for the study. In regards to technology selection, when you are picking a specific device, you might do a literature search and rely on what's out there and what is highly published on in order to implement it into your study. Or if you're selecting something that hasn't been widely researched, you might also conduct your own pre-trial feasibility studies before launching into an asset or drug program. And then always be mindful that there could be measurement errors and expect that there could be variability in the data, as again, these are participants' own devices and not something that the sponsor of the site is directly controlling. Next slide. And when it comes to data management and operations, there's quite a few different things to consider. One thing I think we can all acknowledge with the BYOD approach is ideally participants are already used to using the technology. It's something that they might use day to day, whether it's like a wearable watch or their phone, or maybe even both. But there's still an ample amount of strategies to deploy in order to maintain their compliance throughout the study. So that could be having things in place like alerts via study application, automated reminders, or text or phone calls from the site in order to make sure that they are wearing their device, or if they're having to enter data, that they're also doing that on an ongoing basis. And this also helps facilitate, ongoing data monitoring by the site and anyone else who's involved in the process. Early on too, while you're still designing your study, you should determine some kind of compliance threshold and what's required for have a valid data set and what kind of the minimum wear time might be. So if it is like a watch, you might require X amount of hours within a day, or maybe X days per week if it's another type of device or a specific activity the participant needs to engage in. And when capturing this data, it's really important to also think about data transmission, ensuring that proper transmission of the data is ongoing throughout the trial, thinking about connectivity and internet access and how frequently participants may have access to that if data is being uploaded in that manner. Acknowledging again that there could be heterogeneity in the data. If someone is using their own device and the device goes through a software, hardware upgrade throughout, or maybe they lose their device and get a replacement, again, it's really important to kind of capture that metadata on the device so that you know how that could impact the data that's being collected if someone switches or upgrades mid-trial. And then, of course, you want to ensure that all these different data transmission methods are being done with privacy and security at the forefront. So using encryption, backups, and having user authentication to ensure that it really is that participant collecting that data with that device throughout. When it comes to sharing data, you might want to think about whether or not it's appropriate to share the data with the participant throughout the trial. So it could bias your data collection if the participant has access to their data throughout. It might alter their behavior or cause them, more or less use it. So think about whether that's adding value or restricting things. Think about whether it's necessary to really share that data at the end of the study. And then when it comes to confounding variables and contextual data, thinking about how long someone has been using their technology and how frequently they use it. If it is something that they can easily integrate into their life, they're obviously, hopefully you'll get more data and be able to use it more frequently. And then collecting in other contextual data will also help. This obviously, of course, requires the approval of a local ethics or IRB board, but getting information on the participant's employment status, their location, even weather and seasonality data can also be important. Next slide, please. And then the fifth and final item that we discuss in the paper are really around the statistical considerations. So as with any trial, you should always predetermine your minimum sample size that's required for any subsets of the data where you are analyzing your hypotheses. Think about any expected attrition and dropout rates throughout the study, or even non-compliance and technology usage when calculating your sample size. And of course, early on, you should have some strategies to mitigate those dropout rates. So incorporating a comprehensive participant and site training program is vital, both in the beginning and even throughout the study, to ensure that everyone is engaged, and even offering things like technical support, whether 24/7 or on a less frequent cadence, having it available to participants and their caregivers can help give them a seamless experience throughout the study. And then, of course, your statistical analysis plan should assess any potential biases in the population, variability introduced by deploying more than one technology, any variability arising from a mixture of BYOD and provision technologies, and approaches to account for missing data, and of course, conduct fit-for-purpose sensitivity analyses. Next slide. So in conclusion, these are just some of the considerations we've identified in order to be able to successfully implement a BYOD model in clinical research trials. Although many studies are happening today and even some being published, there's still many questions that remain around the feasibility of the approach. We've asked ourselves, does it provide the same insights as a provision device approach? And can the approach be fully operationalized in a pivotal global study? And while the body of evidence doesn't fully exist yet, I think we can all acknowledge that the field is rapidly evolving. A lot of this is driven in part in the growing interest of decentralized and flexible trials, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, and offering, something to patients where maybe they don't have to constantly be coming into a clinical trial site. So we really anticipate that future studies will showcase more and more new examples of BYOD deployments, and we'll also be able to see what some of their lessons learned have been from these studies. And then we'll hopefully also see some emerging regulatory guidelines that we can add additional considerations to those we've already outlined today. Next slide. And I think we would just like to thank all of the authors here. So Charmaine, Cynthia, Krishna, Emra, Cindy, Kelly, Elena, and Marie. It's been fantastic working with the entire group on this publication. And it's also linked here for everyone to be able to easily access after this session.
Oh, that was brilliant. Thank you. And just a reminder, all of these slides will be available, and they're so good. I anticipate, as you know, everything that DIME publishes puts on our website is shareable, and you can share this with your teams. This is your chance, folks. I'm going to stop sharing to ask questions of this incredible group of authors, and stop sharing, but you can always pull up slides if you need to. And there are some questions already in the chat. Right. Rachel, do you want to ask your question live, or should I read it?
Oh, sure. I suppose I can. Hi, this is Rachel Chassie. Congratulations and fantastic work to the research committee, and of course to our fantastic presenters, Charmaine and Pirinka. I really like seeing this publication for many reasons. I think BYOD is a natural space for the industry to trend towards, but of course, for many reasons, as you mentioned, it can make teams a little bit nervous to do so. So thank you for the publication framework to really hand keys to folks to figure out how to do this well. My question is in the chat, but I think as for the BYOD space to really gain a lot of traction, there will have to be some head-to-head comparisons about data quality for BYOD versus provision models. So while teams perhaps are internally looking and comparing kind of output from these two models, I'm wondering what advice do you have for those teams who are looking to do those kinds of comparisons?
So thank you, Rachel. It's nice to hear your voice, and thank you for your interesting question. I can take a stab at answering this. So basically, it is a multifaceted approach, right? So first of all, the teams need to do due diligence even before the study start, right? Through, for example, pretrial feasibility studies to understand if we have to deploy different technologies in the study, do they match? Do the endpoints that I get from these different models, the different versions of the same device even match, and have what is the data variability and the endpoint reliability across these different options? Then I think once we're doing the analysis, and if you have a situation where you have BYOD and provision models within the same study, it's important to understand what's the impact of compliance and data quality. What's the demographic data of these two cohorts, and what is the distribution across the different study arms? Because that could really bias your output, right? If, for example, you have different age distributions or different socioeconomic distribution between the BYOD and provision device, and they're not evenly split across study arms, that could definitely bias, for example, the treatment effect. So I think that's something that we need to do at the analysis phase, and there needs to be documented, even in the SAP, how you're going to approach these different situations. So I don't know if this answers your question, Rachel.
Yeah, Charmaine, thank you. Well, it's always a treat and a privilege to learn from you, and this was no exception too. I think sometimes teams can maybe define what they're hoping to learn from those kinds of models, especially deploying both within the same study. You'll get a lot of information one way, perhaps, but then perhaps you'll also learn a lot about operations and enrollment, et cetera, too. So lots of things to learn overall from the study design. So thanks again to the team.
Yeah, and absolutely. I think Valerie asked the question about basically technology shouldn't limit participation. And we talk a lot about this in the study, right? That basically it should not, if a participant wants to participate in the study and it's BYOD, especially if it's an interventional study, we should not let technology limit that participation. And I think that's a great suggestion. We did not really discuss the USDA Reconnect program, Valerie. But it's a great initiative, and I'll definitely read up about that after this journal club.
Both really great questions, and tackled two of my questions that I had in my queue. Audience members, this is your chance to ask questions, but I actually do have some questions for you guys. Mostly because I am relatively new to this field. I would love to hear from you both how your work at Pfizer reflects some of this. So how are you, if you are, and how are you using bring your own device in your clinical trials? And so give us some examples maybe, or how this is sort of realized, this work has been sort of realized at Pfizer.
Sure, Pirinka, do you want to take that? Sure. So I can take that. I think there's a definitely like a multitude of ways that we're doing it. I think I'm sure everyone's also doing this, but I think phones are obviously like a really big one, both with ePros, but as Charmaine said, we're kind of also steering away from other ways. So even in trials where, let's say, we've deployed like some type of wearable watch device, having either it's someone's owned device, or rather it could be something we provision to them. We have, let's say, like a phone as part of the component, facilitating data transfers and facilitating any other like information that's collected in the trial as well. I don't know if you want to speak to any specific examples, Charmaine.
Yeah, we've done one recent study that's in clinicaltrials.gov that used BYOD approach to basically collect voice and symptom data from a wide range of participants. So that's one approach. It was just a phone with an app, basically with a study app deployed on that. But there are very good examples also in the literature, especially with surveillance study for flu and COVID. That really have leveraged both the phone of participants as well as their wearable devices to basically derive new endpoints.
Okay, quiet group. All right, remember, you can always put your hand up to ask a question. All right, well, let's go back to, I really enjoyed how you laid out the steps, because it's very organized and really helped me as a somewhat outsider to this be able to see how you really walk through from the very beginning. And I thought stakeholder engagement is, maybe that's obvious to you guys, but I think being able to really sit down at the beginning and understand what's important to people, both from like what are meaningful outcomes, but also how are trials like this going to affect your internal and external stakeholders. I would love to hear how you do that at Pfizer. Like, really, how do you operationalize those that concept of engaging stakeholders, groups, or just really some specifics there you could.
Yeah, I can start with that. I think communicating out on, I think well, a couple of different things. I think what I talked about, bidirectional interactions, I think it's really important in a large organization, especially such as Pfizer, to constantly be in communication. So I think being able to understand what it is that the whole organization is working on and seeing if there are use cases for an approach like this, and then also sharing out on the work we do. So we obviously do a lot of work with wearables, BYOD, et cetera, within the group. But if we're, not kind of sharing out some of that work, there could be things kind of going on in tandem. So I think, or in parallel to each other. So I think sharing out constant communication across an organization is super important. And then also involving all the different stakeholders. So I think I had some examples on that slide of the different stakeholders, whether it's medical affairs or regulatory affairs. There could be, again, like different use cases as some, like, I'll just say a drug product as an example is moving from early phase research to, phase 2, phase 3 trials, and then eventually being commercialized. So again, communicating and understanding like what could be an appropriate way to implement something as BYOD is really important. I guess ways to do that. Charmaine, I don't know if you want to add anything else to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent reply. I would also like to mention that apart from the internal stakeholders, we do a lot of work with also the external partners, especially the patients. It's really important to understand how the study design, the technology, the app, for example, the study app, is perceived by the patients and whether it serves them, right? Because if it doesn't, then you're going to get poor compliance anyway. And one way to do that is to basically get patient panels. So really have the voice of the patient incorporated in your study design and incorporated in the way you're deploying the technology, and make amendments even before you start. If that cannot be done, then at least have end of study questionnaires so that you can understand basically what to do in the next study and don't repeat the mistakes that might have happened in the current one. The second piece is, of course, the sites. We need to partner very well with the sites and train them to ensure that they're familiar with the technology, with the support that they need to give to patients, where they need to reach out to if there is, for example, some tech support, that some numbers or some people they need to reach out to, and external CROs, for example. The sites need to be very well trained so that they give confidence to the participants and their caregivers, and that will ensure basically that you have good data. I think with models like BYOD, it really takes a village to operationalize this. It's a really big endeavor, especially at the start, right? Especially as we're trying to take a traditional approach, a traditional clinical trial setting that existed for many years, and then try to implement a novel aspect to it, which is BYOD model. And often if the data from BYOD is going to be used as like a primary objective with primary endpoint, that adds even the pressure, right, to basically making sure that we do right by patients and the data we collect is good quality so that we can really have a valid trial with robust findings. So it's really a learning experience, even for me. Like when I'm always impressed by how much I learn when we conduct even aspects of BYOD trials or a full BYOD study. It's really a learning process, and it takes a lot of open communication, as Pirinka just talked about.
Yeah, I really like what you mentioned about sites and patients. I think that's at the core of once we're launched and executed, how to really be successful.
Yeah, and the other piece is the technical piece, right? The technical piece, the people who are working with the data usually have a lot of responsibility to basically understand the data as it comes in. There are many issues that will arise with BYOD because of the heterogeneity of the data. You're allowing different models, different versions. And it's really, you need to have a good technical team to really work very well with the clinicians and with the whole operations to basically make sure that any findings from the data are properly communicated and tackled.
Oh my gosh, this is sort of like changing the wheels on the bus while the bus is moving kind of work. I mean, what I keep hearing you say is so much flexibility, so much engagement with all the different internal and external stakeholders. I'm looking at the questions from both Rachel and Colleen that speak to me. You're asking teams, both internal and external, to be incredibly flexible, right? But also maintain those high standards. So I'm curious, Rachel's question, advice for convincing teams to try out bring your own device models. I'm just imagining, within your experience, are there specific, departments or groups that you've had to work particularly hard, or like what sort of strategies you had to really invent?
Yeah, there's one example I have. If you're looking to launch in like a very large scale study, I think cost is definitely always a big concern of an organization. So, I mean, I'll just again use the phone example. If you're provisioning thousands of phones, and let's say you want to be able to collect quality data and you have certain requirements that require like a newer version of a phone or within the last 5 years in order to be able to, have maybe security considerations, not lots of different things. That's a very high cost. So I think the BYOD model is then quite attractive, since we don't have to, one, pay for the cost of the phone, the shipping, mailing back and forth. If the cost is definitely like a big one. And then of course, I would also say like, it also might be like patient comfort. I think if, again, with the phone example, if we're giving everyone a phone, odds are like you already have your own personal phone, you might even have a work phone, and now you're balancing like 3 different phones where you're doing different things, and you might be less willing, or you might start to disengage as the trial goes on with that second or third phone, just because it's kind of a pain to bring it everywhere, or take it with you on vacation if you're in a trial for a long time and you're collecting this data remotely. So I think, yeah, cost, and then also like patients, kind of like usability and willingness to already use a device they already have and they're comfortable with.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But you are pushing complexity, you're taking complexity away from the patient, but pushing it into your data teams and pushing into study design, thinking about like some of the considerations that you put down. Really have to pay a lot of attention to data quality, and if people are changing their devices midway, and then thinking about equity, probably having to deploy a lot of really creative strategies to make sure you've got culturally accessible and sort of support for people to use devices. So Colleen has a question related to this. Colleen, did you want to ask your question live? If you are we can unmute you.
I can. Hello, and thanks everybody. This is great work. My question is regarding a sense of willingness to step into this space. It just seems like you list all the pros and cons, and it just feels like the cons are pretty massive. And it just, I'm wondering if there's any survey data or anything of industry stakeholders that would give us a feeling for the readiness to really embrace this concept.
Yeah, so I would say, so thank you, Colleen, for your question. I would say it's very probably industry specific and company specific, and it depends on basically what the particular company or industry is trying to push forward. I have to say, we presented this paper at the DIA in June, and there was definitely a lot of discussion and a lot of interest. So I don't have the formal survey, but I think a lot of different companies are attempting to do this, to try this approach. Whether we're ready to try this approach in interventional and full-blown interventional phase 3 trials versus more like observational real-world evidence studies, that I think it's more basically doable. And it might take a little bit more work to arrive at like full-blown interventional trials relying on BYOD for their primary endpoint. But I think the field is moving in the right direction, and I think the time is right to start taking good steps, not baby steps, but good steps in basically deploying more BYOD models. in our trials. Definitely not every trial is gonna benefit from BYOD approach, but some others are fit for purpose. And basically, what I wanted to add to Rachel's comment, which ties to your comment, Colleen, is like convincing teams to try out BYOD models. I think the first bit is what is the value add, right? What is the value add that this model is going to bring that you can't answer from with traditional approaches? Is it going to increase your reach of patients? Is it going to help you recruit faster because patients just have to download the app on their phone without you having to deploy to basically deliver the devices? So it is all about the value add, and that's why it's a conversation. It's really a conversation that involves many people in the organization.
Yes.
And it's going to be
so
probably
much.
a different conversation every time.
Yeah.
Depending on the team you're going to engage with, it's going to be probably a very different conversation every time. But even with wearable technologies, right? When we started like 5 years ago or so, it was very different, the conversations we have than we're having now, because once there is some momentum, once we do the first, the second, the third trial, and we show equivalence, we show interest in the data, in robustness in the findings, then I think it starts gaining momentum.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so keep my eye on the chat. Oh, let's see here. Oh, there's a new question from Valerie Schaefer. Valerie, did you want to ask your question live, or do you want me to read it? Oh, can't hear you, Valerie. I'll read the question. You can add some color if you can get your audio to work. So Valerie asks, do you think that tying the data collection for clinical trials to clinical care using the same app would be another pro? I adore this question because I work on the delivery side rather than the research side. And I like, how can we draw that direct line into letting our physicians now be able to see how well interventions are working. So can you guys, do you want to speak to that question?
Yeah, I'm probably not the best person to answer this question because I'm far as possible from being an HCP. but basically, I think it really has to have a conversation with the clinical team, right, and the clinical care and the HCPs, and see as an external stakeholder and see how that can be incorporated. I think that's great. The more usage you can have. But again, it depends on basically the purpose, what type of clinical trial you have. Is it interventional? Is it an observational clinical trial? Is it a real-world evidence trial? So it really depends, I would say. But again, I'm not the best person to answer this question, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would agree with what Charmaine mentioned. Again, it could be case by case specific, like with so many things. If there is value add, I think it would be a good place where it would maybe remove some redundancies in the same data you collected, whether it is like a questionnaire data or like other objective measures from a sensor or wearable device. They could tie together really well, but then I'm sure there's also some probably like clinical regulatory conversations that would also need to be had on this topic.
No, I think this is a great discussion. And when I, again, from the healthcare side, I was just at a conference where it was payers and organizations trying to deploy digital technology, not in research, but in care. And the question kept coming up, how is this safe? Is there evidence? How do we, and I mean, I kept having to go back to the work that you folks have been so highly active in the V3 framework and the evidence checklist, and really trying to train clinicians that from the very get-go, the organizations that are following these really robust processes for selecting and validating measures are really, those are the ones that you really need to look at. And I'm curious, you did reference on one of your slides that that you recommend using those very sort of robust processes for validation. Can you talk a little bit more about how you considered the V3 framework and evidence checklists as far back as like really selecting measures and devices that were going to make sense?
Yeah, so I can start. I think for the V3 framework, obviously, hopefully everyone's pretty familiar with it, but it involves device verification, analytical and clinical validation. And I think once you have those three things for a device, whether, again, you've run your own feasibility pre-trial studies and you're confident in the endpoints and the data being collected off of the device, and for the use case, of course, you're hopefully in a good place that you want to either make a decision on the device. Either you're confident that you can implement it, or maybe it's not the best choice for your trial. I think for the evidence checklist, I think we mentioned it there in regards to technology performance evaluation. So again, making sure that the technology that you have selected is performing well, whether for the patients or the other stakeholders involved in the study. That's kind of at a high level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's really, when we were writing the paper, actually, we leveraged, as Pirinka said, the V3 framework and the evidence checklist and the playbook, because some aspects of the BYOD, right, are not different than if you are running another device incorporating wearable technology. You need to make sure that your endpoint, their outcome assessment, is clinically meaningful. You need to make sure that your endpoint is accurate and reliable and has clinical and analytical validation attached to it before you select it for your trial. And basically also looking at privacy concerns, which the privacy and security concerns, which the playbook really talks about and outlines very nicely. That's all things that you would do in a normal trial, but they're just like somehow even more escalated in terms of privacy and security in a BYOD model, because you're using, say, the participant's own device, and then you're attaching a study app, you're installing a study app on their device, so that they need to be completely sure that the data that they're getting from there is being safe, secure, and the privacy considerations have all been tackled, and they can feel confident, patients can feel confident. So basically, these are excellent resources that we really leverage during the writing of our manuscript.
It seems to me that those could also speak to how do you convince internal stakeholders that you're doing this in a robust way, pointing them, this is how these are the industry standards, this is what we follow. These are robust checklists that we go through to really help not alleviate concerns, but show them that you've really gone through the process.
Yeah, that you're not starting from scratch, right? There is a body of work there and a lot of due diligence that have happened before, and you're now taking that to the next level in a BYOD approach.
And I always like to ask participants questions myself, because you're here because you're really interested. Do you, Charmaine and Pirinka, have any questions that you would ask to the participants about what they're doing? I'm sure we're all really curious what each other's doing. This is the club. What would you ask the participants and put all these wonderful people on the spot?
Well, I always think whenever we produce a body of work, right, what have we missed? What are the things that if you were writing this manuscript and you are working in the field of BYOD, you would have liked to add and to see? How can we make this better? And it would be nice to hear some of the suggestions that the audience has on the matter.
Or what's next?
Or what's next?
Oh, bye. Hi. Since I asked y'all so many questions, I'll return the favor and try to answer one. I'd like to see I think sometimes, I think maybe I've been hinting towards this a little bit in the questions that I've been asking in the chat, is that the BYOD model is the natural trend of the industry. But there's still a lot of folks who are a little bit nervous about it for many good reasons. But I'm wondering, is there kind of examples of kind of low-hanging fruit that teams can just, I guess, practice or try out the BYOD model in a way that's, not necessarily the highest risk, but in a way that can allow folks to get some sort of, return on trying out this model, to show feasibility for the model, to show that yes, we can trust patients to some extent. Yes, they do know what they're doing, kind of that way. What would be an example perhaps of, I guess I suppose, an easy way to try this out for teams? That's perhaps for teams that are a bit risk averse. Oh, wait, did I answer your question with a question? That's not how that was supposed to work. I'm sorry, but I guess that could be an example of something to see in it.
It's such a great question, though. I had the same one. I was going to say, so what are the easiest and no-brainers? What are the, like, maybe if you get it right, and then maybe there's like a list of things that are not appropriate. I'm curious, like that would be like my next, like, how would we maybe start to think about that, like you said, any takers?
A couple things that come to mind, Charmaine, you can add to it, I think, can be running first maybe studies in other populations. So maybe again, not in a drug study, but maybe it is like a healthy volunteer study, maybe it is those feasibility studies. So then, and maybe they're published out there, but I feel like, sometimes maybe the organization wants to see that, we have done it as an organization and have been able to operationalize it. So I think that can help. And then even doing maybe like a hybrid model of provisioned versus BYOD, and making sure that you have, enough people using both, and seeing, is the data that's being collected to the BYOD really the same as the other data that's being collected in the same, I guess, patient population. That could be another approach, like a hybrid or kind of like a sub-study with using BYOD as opposed to provisioned.
Yeah, I think that's the same way I would have answered. Yeah, starting small, starting with observational studies, to iron out basically the process, and then moving forward to the big meat of interventional studies.
Yeah, I was thinking too, like post-market could be a really interesting
post-market, yes,
go.
exactly. Post-market.
Because we are so desperate to understand how things are working in real life, and we potentially do have messier data, but lot bigger data sets. So Rebecca Orlinger from my team has done so much work with the pediatric population, and I don't know if she's in a place where she can ask the question, but I think that might be a population where there's so much potential, but also a lot of challenges. So I'm wondering if you could speak to both, your experience in that, but also what you might speculate might be the opportunities and challenges.
Yeah, I think the pediatric is definitely a very interesting field, right? It certainly comes with different challenges, because you would have also in some cases the caregiver perspective too, right? Like the caregiver's intervention on their or access to their technology, restrictions to some of the technology. Some of these pediatric populations have schools, for example, that might limit some of the technologies. So it adds another layer, I think, of complexity. Although kids are very used to technology these days, so getting data from, say, teens will be very much easier, right? You'll have probably high compliance, but it's definitely comes with its challenges.
Yeah, I would add to that and say, in younger children, maybe outside of teens, I wonder if recruitment could also sometimes be an issue. Maybe some parents we want to limit technology in their homes. Obviously, school is another place where it could be limited, as Charmaine mentioned. But perhaps they might not be as apt to be involved. There could be like a learning curve about what could be done there, and also educating both the children and the parent or caregiver about the study, and really doing like a little bit more extra education and due diligence with both of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's not just one more thing for the parents or caregivers to take care of, but something that makes it easier for them.
Yeah, and I would say what we have experienced is that, especially in the rare disease space, parents and children are very willing to participate in these trials, because they see this as an approach to understanding more the disease, basically getting faster treatments available to them. In many cases, there are no treatments, right, for some of these rare diseases, and they are devastating. So basically, I think the engagement from the rare disease community has always been very impressive to me. So some populations might be a lot more amenable than others.
Yeah, especially if the disease is more debilitating too. You can tell there's a lot more like motivation to look for alternative methods and ways of research.
Excellent. Okay, I'm looking at the chat. I don't see any other questions. Do you have any final thoughts or advice that you'd like to sort of put out to this group, as well as the future people listening to this recording, Charmaine or Pirinka? Anything else you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the interest in the topic. I think it's really great to see to have so many questions about it, and I think it would be great. I'm looking forward to the future where we see a bigger body of evidence of trials conducted with BYOD, and I hope that we can learn more from case studies, for example, as groups perform these studies and then document what they've learned from these studies. That is something that I really look forward to. And then also I look forward to seeing more concrete regulatory guidance that would help inform us as stakeholders on what we're gonna on how to approach this. So yeah, I think the future is bright. I'm really looking forward to seeing where this BYOD model takes us and how it's deployed to accelerate research and clinical trials.
Likewise, everything you shared, Charmaine. I'm also curious if anyone in this group has, run BYOD trials, if, the things we shared and spoke to today have been widely used. Again, if there was anything missed or if there was anything that came as a surprise, would love to kind of like learn more and continue the conversation. And thank you, Lynette, for hosting this session. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, it's my pleasure too. And everyone here is on the DIME member Slack, and that is such a perfect place to continue the conversation. So, let's get a thread going, or slap your experience of bringing your own device trials in there and see, can continue the conversation. So, as you can see, everyone in the chat, we've got another journal club coming up for October 5th. You can register. There's a link right there. Let's see. Any other questions you come up with? Again, I think urge you to look at the Slack channel and use that. That's for you guys to communicate. Oh, Rachel had a question. Rachel, you want to sneak in one last quick question, or is that it is a question?
Oh, no, not a question, just an applause. So thanks to the research committee and for our presenters today. Very fantastic work.
Yeah, and thank you both. Excellent work. And we'll see you in October.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye.